In this episode, we're going to take the privacy policies you've been building in your head and turn them into something that actually runs on the ground, because a policy that cannot be executed is just a wish. The Certified Information Privacy Manager, CIPM, exam expects you to understand that policies become real only when frontline teams can follow them during normal work without stopping everything to ask for permission. That is where procedures come in, and procedures are not fancy paperwork, because they are the repeatable ways people do things when time is tight and the situation is not perfectly clean. You'll learn what procedures are, how they differ from policies, and how they convert abstract requirements into predictable actions across the full data lifecycle. By the end, you should be able to look at a policy statement and describe the procedure that would make it happen reliably, with clear ownership, sensible timing, and measurable outcomes. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A procedure is a repeatable method that tells people how to carry out a requirement in a consistent way. And the key word is consistent, because consistency is what prevents privacy from becoming a guessing game. Policies say what must be true, such as data must be collected for defined purposes and retained only as long as needed, but frontline teams do not live inside concepts. They live inside tasks. A procedure bridges that gap by embedding privacy requirements into the steps people already take, like creating an account workflow, onboarding a vendor, responding to a customer request, or escalating an incident. This matters because most privacy failures are not caused by someone deciding to break a rule. They are caused by a workflow that never made the rule executable. When procedures are missing, people improvise, and improvisation creates uneven results across teams and regions, which is exactly what oversight agencies and customers notice. The Privacy Program Manager's job is to make the correct behavior easier than the incorrect behavior, and procedures are one of the most practical tools for doing that at scale. The difference between a policy and a procedure becomes clearer when you imagine a new employee joining a team and trying to do the right thing without knowing your organization's history. A policy might say that personal information should be shared with third parties only under appropriate controls, but the new employee still needs to know how to request a vendor review, what information to provide, and what approvals are required before data moves. A policy might say that rights requests must be handled on time, but the support agent still needs to know where to log the request, how to verify identity, and who to contact for data retrieval. A policy might say that retention should be limited, but the system owner still needs to know how retention schedules are defined, how deletion is triggered, and how exceptions are approved. Procedures provide those practical answers in a way that can be repeated, taught, and measured. When you understand this distinction, you stop trying to cram procedures into policies, and you start designing a clean chain where policies set direction and procedures create execution. That chain is how a privacy program becomes operational rather than theoretical. Procedures have to match the reality of frontline work, which means they must account for time pressure, incomplete information, and competing priorities. Frontline teams often operate in environments where speed is rewarded, such as customer support queues, product releases, marketing campaign schedules, and procurement timelines. If your procedure adds friction without offering clarity, teams will avoid it, even if they respect the goal, because the business will keep moving. A usable procedure, therefore, needs to be short enough to follow, clear enough to reduce hesitation, and integrated enough that it feels like part of the job rather than a separate compliance ritual. This is also why procedure design cannot be done in isolation by the privacy team alone, because privacy does not live the daily workflow and may accidentally design steps that are unrealistic. A privacy program manager collaborates with the people who do the work so procedures reflect real constraints and real decision points. When procedures are built this way, privacy becomes a normal part of operations rather than an emergency interrupt. That is the kind of operational maturity that CIPM is measuring. A strong procedure begins with a trigger, because triggers tell people when the procedure applies and remove the need for guesswork about whether privacy needs to be involved. Triggers can be events like collecting a new category of personal information, changing a product feature that affects data use, starting a new analytics initiative, engaging a new vendor, or expanding service to a new region. Triggers can also be thresholds, such as processing that involves sensitive data, large-scale profiling, or automated decision-making that affects individuals. Without triggers, people will either over-engage privacy on low-risk work, creating bottlenecks, or under-engage privacy on high-risk work, creating surprises. A procedure also needs clear inputs, meaning what information the frontline team must provide, because privacy reviews and decisions cannot be made with vague descriptions. Inputs might include purpose, data categories, user population, sharing partners, retention intentions, and security safeguards at a high level. When triggers and inputs are clear, privacy work becomes predictable and faster because the system does not rely on back-and-forth clarification. This is how procedures reduce friction while still controlling risk. Ownership is another element that makes procedures executable, because a procedure without ownership becomes a suggestion. The procedure should identify who starts it, who completes key steps, who approves outcomes, and who is accountable for ensuring it happens consistently. For example, in a vendor onboarding procedure, procurement might initiate the intake, the business owner might provide processing details, privacy might review use and obligations, security might review safeguards, and legal might review contract terms, with a clear approver for final go or no-go decisions. In a rights request procedure, customer support might initiate intake and verification, system owners might retrieve data, privacy might review response completeness, and a designated owner might approve any denials or limitations. Ownership must also include escalation, because procedures break when people hit obstacles and do not know who can unblock them. Escalation is not about blaming. It is about ensuring deadlines and obligations are met even when normal paths stall. When ownership and escalation are defined, frontline teams can act confidently instead of hesitating, which reduces both errors and delays. This is why procedures are as much about organizational clarity as they are about task steps. One of the best ways to make privacy procedures executable is to integrate them into existing workflows rather than creating parallel processes, because parallel processes are the fastest way to create bypassing. If product teams already use an intake step for new features, privacy review should be embedded there as a standard checkpoint with clear triggers. If procurement already uses a vendor request process, privacy and security review should be built into that flow with defined data handling questions and approval steps. If customer support already logs tickets, rights requests should be captured through that system or tightly linked to it, so nothing gets lost in email threads. Integration also allows automation of reminders and tracking, which reduces reliance on memory and personal diligence. The point is not to add bureaucracy. It is to make privacy steps appear at the exact moment teams are already making relevant decisions. When privacy procedures are integrated, teams experience them as part of quality and readiness rather than as obstacles. That shift in perception is a major factor in durable adoption, and durable adoption is what reduces long-term risk. Risk-based depth is another core principle, because procedures that treat every task as high risk will create bottlenecks and resentment, and procedures that treat everything as low risk will miss the moments that need stronger scrutiny. A practical privacy program builds procedures with tiers of review, where routine and low-impact activities follow a lighter path and higher-impact activities follow a deeper path. Deeper paths often include structured assessment, such as a Data Protection Impact Assessment, DPIA, which is a documented evaluation of risks, mitigations, and residual risk decisions for processing that could significantly affect individuals. Even when the label differs in different organizations, the concept is consistent. Higher risk processing deserves more deliberate evaluation and stronger documentation. The procedure must make this distinction clear by defining what characteristics push an activity into deeper review, like sensitive data, children's data, large-scale profiling, or cross-border implications. This helps frontline teams because it provides a rational explanation for why some projects require more steps, which reduces frustration and improves compliance. It also helps the privacy function because it allows scarce expert attention to focus on the work that matters most. A particularly important procedural area is data collection and purpose management, because many privacy problems begin at the start of the data lifecycle when data is gathered too broadly or used too flexibly. A usable procedure for new data collection should require teams to define purpose in plain language, identify which data fields are truly needed, and document how those fields will be used. It should also require review when a team wants to add new data categories or use existing data for a new purpose, because secondary use is a common source of surprise and complaint. The procedure should include a step that checks alignment with notices and commitments, because what the organization tells people must match what the organization does. It should also include a step that considers whether the same outcome could be achieved with less identifying data, less retention, or less sharing, because minimization is a practical risk reduction tool. Frontline teams need these steps to be clear and fast, not philosophical, so the procedure should guide them towards specific decisions rather than broad principles. When a program operationalizes purpose and minimization this way, it prevents downstream complexity in rights handling, retention, and incident exposure. Retention and disposal procedures are where privacy policies often fail, not because the principle is unclear, but because the execution requires coordination across systems, owners, and vendors. A usable retention procedure should connect data categories to retention periods and deletion triggers, and it should assign ownership for maintaining those schedules. It should also require that new systems and new vendors support the retention expectations, because a retention policy that cannot be enforced in third-party platforms becomes a permanent exception. The procedure should include a regular review cadence so retention rules stay aligned with changing business purposes and obligations, because retention needs often shift as products and services evolve. It should also include a way to handle holds and legal obligations that require retention, because real life sometimes requires keeping data longer for defined reasons, and that must be documented and controlled. Frontline system owners need a procedure that tells them how to request retention guidance, how to implement retention decisions, and how to confirm deletion outcomes at a high level. When retention procedures are clear, the organization reduces exposure, simplifies rights request fulfillment, and improves defensibility under oversight. That is why retention is a core lifecycle control in a well-run privacy program. Rights request procedures are another area where executability is tested because the work is time-bound and visible to individuals, and failures quickly become complaints. A usable procedure should define intake channels, logging requirements, and how requests are categorized so the correct workflow is triggered, because different request types often require different actions. Identity verification steps should be defined in a way that balances two risks: disclosing personal information to the wrong person and creating barriers so high that legitimate requesters cannot exercise rights. The procedure should define ownership for locating data across systems, because rights requests often span multiple applications and databases, and it should define how vendors are engaged when third-party processing is involved. It should also define review and quality control steps so responses are consistent, complete, and aligned with what the organization can support operationally. Deadlines require tracking and escalation, and the procedure should include those mechanisms so individual staff members are not forced to rely on memory. When rights procedures are predictable and measurable, teams feel less stress, individuals receive more consistent responses, and the organization reduces regulatory exposure. This is exactly the kind of operational maturity that separates program intent from program performance. Vendor and partner procedures turn privacy policies about sharing into real controls, and they are essential because partners expand your data footprint beyond your direct control. A usable vendor procedure should start with early identification, meaning teams should not be able to send data to a vendor before the vendor has been reviewed for privacy and security expectations. The procedure should require clear description of what data will be shared, why it is needed, what processing the vendor will perform, and where processing will occur, because cross-border implications often arrive through vendors. It should define required contract elements at a program level, such as data use limitations, retention expectations, sub-processor controls, incident communication duties, and support for rights requests. It should also include ongoing oversight steps, because vendor practices can change, and change without review is a major source of surprise risk. Frontline procurement teams need this procedure to be integrated into procurement workflows with clear turnaround expectations, because procurement work is often time-sensitive and will bypass slow controls. When vendor procedures are designed well, they protect the organization without turning vendor selection into a constant conflict, which improves stakeholder alignment and reduces long-term risk. Incident and breach procedures are often the most emotionally intense moments for an organization, which is why making them executable ahead of time is so important. A usable procedure should define how suspected incidents are reported, who triages them, and how privacy and security roles coordinate on evaluation. The procedure should guide teams to identify whether personal information is involved, what population may be affected, what the likely harm could be, and what obligations might be triggered, because those factors influence communication decisions. It should define who drafts communications, who approves them, and how timing is tracked, because delays and inconsistent messaging can deepen trust damage and enforcement risk. It should also include a post-incident review step that converts lessons learned into program improvements, such as updating procedures, tightening access, or improving training. Frontline employees should not be expected to invent incident steps during a crisis, because stress reduces reasoning quality and increases mistakes. A mature privacy program makes incident response feel like a practiced routine, even when the incident itself is serious and stressful. The exam often rewards this kind of preparedness because it reflects a program that can manage consequences predictably. Training and adoption procedures are the glue that makes all other procedures actually get used, because people follow what they remember and what their managers reinforce. A usable training procedure defines who must be trained, when training occurs, how completion is tracked, and how non-completion is escalated, because training without accountability becomes optional. It should also include role-based training for high-impact roles, such as support staff handling requests, procurement staff onboarding vendors, and product staff designing new processing, because generic training often misses the decisions people actually make. Training procedures should also define how content is updated, because privacy risks and technologies evolve, especially with new processing like artificial intelligence, AI. A mature program includes a way for employees to ask questions and raise concerns without fear, because early reporting prevents larger failures. Training should connect directly to procedures and workflows, so employees learn not only why privacy matters, but exactly how to do privacy in their job. When training is operationally tied to procedures, adoption becomes stable, and stable adoption is what turns privacy from policy into habit. Measurement and reporting procedures are what keep privacy procedures from quietly degrading over time, because without feedback loops, processes drift and exceptions become the norm. A usable measurement procedure defines what indicators are tracked, how they are collected, and who reviews them, so metrics become part of governance rather than a one-time report. Key performance indicator, KPI, metrics might include completion rates for training, turnaround times for privacy reviews, timeliness of rights request responses, and coverage of vendor oversight. Key risk indicator, KRI, metrics might include rising exception rates, repeated incidents tied to the same control gap, increasing complaints, or repeated late engagement by specific teams. The procedure should also define what happens when metrics show problems, such as assigning corrective actions, escalating persistent issues, and revising workflows to reduce friction. This is how privacy becomes a managed system rather than a set of rules people hope will be followed. Frontline teams benefit from measurement because it clarifies expectations and reduces arguments about whether a process is working. When measurement is embedded in the operating model, procedures stay alive and improve over time. As we close, the big idea is that privacy procedures are the practical mechanisms that make policies executable by frontline teams across the full data lifecycle. And without them, even excellent policy language will fail under real-world pressure. Procedures work when they include clear triggers, required inputs, defined ownership, and escalation paths that keep work moving even when obstacles appear. They become durable when they are integrated into existing workflows, scaled through risk-based depth, and reinforced through training that matches real decisions. They become defensible when they produce documentation and measurable outcomes, using KPI and KRI signals to drive continuous improvement rather than to create performative reporting. Procedures for data collection, retention, rights handling, vendor oversight, and incident coordination are especially critical because they are where most privacy obligations become visible and where trust is won or lost. The CIPM exam is testing whether you can think in this operational way, translating strategy and policy into repeatable, measurable behavior that survives the messy reality of business. When you can consistently explain how a procedure makes a policy real, you are thinking like a privacy program manager, and that is the point of the entire privacy lifecycle mindset.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.